The message came without warning. No signal flare, no diplomatic header, no automated greeting from any known vessel. It simply arrived, cutting through every frequency the Galactic Council monitored, like a stone dropped into still water. The Council's communication officers were the first to hear it. They sat up straight in their chairs. A few of them pressed their headsets tighter against their ears, as if they were afraid they had misheard. They had not misheard. The voice on the transmission was ancient. Not old in the way that civilizations were old. Not a few thousand years of recorded history and crumbling stone buildings. This was something older than that. It was a voice that sounded like it had been speaking long before most of the species on the Council had learned to walk upright. It was slow, heavy, and tired. And yet even in its tiredness, there was a weight to it that made everyone who heard it go very quiet. The voice belonged to Kale Vorithshan, the last of the Vorthian. Most species in the Galactic Council had heard the name but never expected to actually receive a transmission from him. The Vorthian were ancient dragons, enormous, powerful, solitary creatures who had existed since before faster-than-light travel was even a theory. Kale Vorithshan was the oldest of his kind. Scholars estimated his age at somewhere around 40,000 years, though some said that number was probably too low. He had watched 3 suns burn out. He had lived through the collapse of 2 galactic empires that most species now only read about in old texts. He was, in every meaningful sense, a living piece of history. And now he was dying. The transmission lasted only a short time. His voice did not waver much, but the pauses between his words were long, and each breath sounded difficult. He did not speak of regrets. He did not leave behind any philosophical statement or final wisdom for the galaxy to record. He said only one thing that mattered, and he said it clearly enough that there was no confusion about what he meant. He said, "Find the human who knows my name." Then the transmission ended. For a long moment, nobody on the Council vessel said anything at all. Officers looked at each other. A Zathri diplomat sitting near the back of the communication room put down his drink very slowly. A Council elder from the Marathai species, a tall insectoid creature known for never showing surprise at anything, actually stood up from her seat. The confusion was immediate and genuine. Among the Vorthian, a true name was not simply a label. It was not the name that others used to refer to you in conversation or in formal records. A true name was something different entirely. It was the name that carried the full identity of a being, their memory, their spirit, their history. The Vorthian only shared their true name with someone they trusted completely, someone they chose deliberately, someone they believed was worthy of carrying that name forward after they were gone. In 40,000 years, Kale Vorithshan had apparently never done this with anyone. And now he was asking them to find a human who knew it. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Council for barely 200 years. In galactic terms, that was almost nothing. Humans were loud, energetic, sometimes reckless, and surprisingly creative under pressure. Most other species found them either entertaining or exhausting, sometimes both at once. They were not known for deep philosophical traditions or ancient spiritual practices. They had not been around long enough to build that kind of reputation. So the idea that some human, somewhere, had been trusted with the true name of a 40,000-year-old dragon was, to most species on the Council, genuinely baffling. The Council's lead administrator, a quiet and careful Marathai named Solvareth, called an emergency session within the hour. Delegates from 30 species filled the chamber. Everyone had heard the transmission by then. The questions were already flying. Which human was it? A diplomat? A scientist? Someone who had made contact with Kale Vorithshan during some undocumented mission? Was there any record of the Vorthian ever making contact with humanity directly? Staff were sent scrambling through archives. Databases were searched. Old mission logs were pulled up and read through carefully. Nothing came back with an answer. Solvareth ordered a formal delegation to be assembled immediately. They would go to Earth. They would begin asking questions. Time was short. The Vorthian historian Thesanar U, a younger dragon who had traveled to the Council station upon hearing his elder's final transmission, had made it clear that Kale Vorithshan did not have long. Days, perhaps. A week at most. As the delegation prepared to depart, Thesanar U stood at the far end of the docking corridor, looking out at the stars. He was large, much larger than any human, but small compared to what Kale Vorithshan had once been. Someone asked him quietly what would happen if they did not find the human in time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that if Kale Vorithshan passed without his name being held by a trusted witness, then everything the old dragon had ever been, every memory, every year of his 40,000 years, would simply disappear. As if he had never existed at all. The delegation left within the hour. Nobody slept much that night. Earth was busy and bright when the delegation arrived. The landing platform at the North American Council Hub was crowded with ships from 3 different colonies, and the air smelled like rain and engine fuel. Nobody paid much attention to the arriving delegates at first. People were used to alien visitors by now. 200 years of galactic membership had a way of making the extraordinary feel ordinary. But word traveled fast. Within a day of their arrival, media channels across the planet were carrying the story. An ancient dragon, the oldest living creature in the known galaxy, was dying. And he had asked for a human. Not an ambassador. Not a decorated general or a celebrated scientist. Just a human. Someone unnamed. Someone whose connection to a 40,000-year-old dragon was completely unexplained. The delegation, led by Council Administrator Solvareth, set up a formal inquiry office in the hub building. Thessanar traveled with them, though he stayed quiet for the most part. He answered questions when asked, but he spent most of his time watching the humans around him with careful, tired eyes. He had known Kale Vorithshan since he was young. Losing the old dragon was already a weight he carried. The possibility of losing him without the rite being completed was something he did not want to think about too carefully. The interviews began the following morning. They started at the top. The first list of candidates included every human who had ever held a senior diplomatic position with alien species. Ambassadors, special envoys, cultural liaisons. People who had spent years living among non-human civilizations, learning their languages and customs. If any human had spent enough time in the old dragon's company to earn that kind of trust, surely it would be one of them. It was not one of them. The delegation moved on to scientists. Xenobiologists who had studied large alien life forms. Historians who specialized in pre-contact civilizations. Researchers who had written papers about Vorthian culture and tradition. Several of them were genuinely excited to be interviewed and asked many questions of their own. None of them had ever met Kale Vorithshan. They tried philosophers next. Then military officers who had served in deep space postings. Then explorers who had traveled into regions of space that were poorly mapped and rarely visited. One woman named Carol Finch had apparently spent 14 months alone on a research vessel in the Outer Rim and could not account for several weeks of her logs due to a system's failure. For a brief and hopeful hour, she seemed like a real possibility. But when Thessanar met with her personally and described certain physical details about Kale Vorithshan, details not in any public record, she shook her head with genuine regret. She was not the one. By the 4th day, the story had grown larger than anyone expected. News outlets were running hourly updates. Opinion pieces multiplied. Social feeds filled up with theories, guesses, and elaborate explanations from people who had clearly never left their home planet. Some humans claimed, without any evidence, to be the person in question. A few of those claims had to be formally investigated before being dismissed. It was time-consuming and frustrating. Other species were watching closely. And not all of them were watching with sympathy. On the Council's general broadcast channel, a Zathri delegate named Provsol gave a short speech that was not technically an insult but felt very much like one. He said that the search had confirmed what many species had long suspected, that humanity, despite its energy and enthusiasm, simply lacked the cultural and spiritual depth required for a Vorthian bond of trust. He said it politely. He said it with what appeared to be regret. But the meaning was clear, and many humans heard it. The delegation heard it too. Solvareth noted it without comment and continued the work. Thessanar, for his part, said nothing publicly about Provsol's remarks. But that evening, he sat alone in the inquiry office long after the others had gone to rest, reading through old Vorthian records on a small personal device. He was looking for any detail, any clue in Kale Vorithshan's movements over the past few decades that might point to when and where a human had crossed his path. The records were incomplete. The old dragon had traveled widely and quietly for much of the last century, preferring to move alone and unannounced. There were long gaps in the documented record where his location was simply unknown. He had not filed travel reports with the council. He had not sent regular messages. He had, by all accounts, lived the last portion of his life exactly as he wished, moving through the galaxy on his own terms, without ceremony. Which meant that the answer to this question might not be in any database at all. On the 5th day, Solvareth called the delegation together and delivered the conclusion that none of them wanted to say out loud. Earth had been searched thoroughly. Colonies at 2 nearby star systems had been contacted. Every reasonable candidate had been interviewed. They had found no one. Thessanar U received a message from the Vorthian vessel that evening. Kale Vorithshan was weaker. He was sleeping more. But he had opened his eyes that afternoon and said the same thing again, quietly and clearly. "Find the human who knows my name. He smells of cleaning solution and stardust." The delegation booked a return passage to the council station. They had run out of places to look on Earth. They did not yet know that the answer had been waiting for them at the station the whole time. The error was small. In any other situation, it would have been nothing, a minor filing gap in a routine staff registry update that had been sitting in a low-priority queue for weeks. A junior administrative officer named Petra found it while doing a standard audit the morning after the delegation returned from Earth, tired and discouraged. The Galactic Council Station was large. It had to be. Housing delegates from over 200 species meant housing their staff, their equipment, their cultural needs, their dietary requirements, their medical facilities, and several thousand support workers who kept everything running. Engineers, cooks, translators, medics, technicians, and maintenance crews. The people who fixed the ventilation systems when they rattled, who kept the water recyclers clean, who mopped the long corridors at night and made sure the waste disposal units did not back up during a diplomatic dinner. Those workers had not been included in the search. Nobody had thought to include them. The search had been designed to find someone important, and without anyone saying it out loud, everyone had quietly assumed that important meant someone with a title. Petra almost filed the registry gap away and moved on. But something about it made her pause. There was a human listed in the Maintenance and Sanitation Division who had not been interviewed. He had worked on the station for 11 years. His name was in the system. His shift logs were complete and unremarkable. His name was Calvin Dury. Age 54. Born in a small town in Ohio. No academic degrees. No military service record. No diplomatic postings. He had been hired as a general maintenance and sanitation worker and had been doing that job quietly and without incident ever since. Petra sent a note to Solvareth. She apologized in the note for what was probably a waste of everyone's time. Solvareth read the note, set it down, and then picked it up and read it again. Thessanar U was the one who went to find Calvin. He did not bring a formal escort. He did not send an announcement ahead. He walked through the lower maintenance corridors of the station alone, his large frame moving carefully through hallways that were not designed with dragons in mind, until he found the section where Calvin was scheduled to be working. Calvin was replacing a filter unit in a ventilation shaft housing when Thessanar U arrived. He had his head partway inside the housing and was muttering something quietly to himself about the threading on a particular bolt. He did not hear Thessanar U approach until the dragon's shadow fell across the corridor floor. Calvin pulled his head out of the shaft, looked up, and did not appear especially alarmed. He had worked on the station for 11 years. Large non-human creatures were not unusual. Thessanar U introduced himself carefully and explained, as simply as he could, why he was there. He described the transmission. He described the search. He explained that they had been to Earth and found nothing, and that they were running out of time. Calvin listened without interrupting. He was a heavy-set man with a calm face and steady eyes. He had grease on his hands and a small scanner clipped to his belt. When Thessanar U finished speaking, Calvin was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands. Then he looked back up. He asked, in a voice that was careful and almost hesitant, whether the old dragon had a scar on his left inner wing, shaped like a crescent. Thessanar U went completely still. That detail was not in any public record. It was not in any database the delegation had searched. It was not something that could be guessed. The scar had been there since before Thessanar U himself had been born, and Kale Vorithshan had never spoken of it openly to anyone. Thessanar U knew about it only because he had once asked the old dragon directly, during a private conversation, and Kale Vorithshan had told him the brief and quiet story of how it had happened. For the first time in days, Thessalonaryu felt something shift in his chest. He told Calvin that yes, the scar was there. He asked how Calvin knew that. Calvin set his scanner down on top of the ventilation housing. He took a breath. He said that he had seen it 9 years ago in this very corridor, a few sections down from where they were standing now. He said that at the time, he had not known what the creature was. He had just found something enormous and hurt and confused, and he had done what seemed like the right thing to do. Thessalonaryu stared at him for a long moment. Then he asked Calvin, very quietly, if he would be willing to come with him. Calvin said he would need to finish the filter replacement first, because if he left it half done the ventilation would cycle wrong and the corridor would smell bad by morning. Thessalonaryu waited. Calvin finished the job, wiped his hands on a cloth, picked up his small toolkit, and followed the dragon down the corridor. On the way to the Vorthian vessel, they passed several station staff members who stopped and stared at the unusual pair. Nobody said anything. Thessalonaryu walked. Calvin walked beside him, shorter by about 2 meters, carrying his toolkit and looking thoughtful. Word reached Solvarith before they arrived. The administrator stood at the docking entrance and watched Calvin Dury come through the door. He looked at the man for a moment, the grease on his uniform, the old work boots, the calm and unhurried expression, and then looked at Thessalonaryu. Thessalonaryu gave a single slow nod. Solvarith stepped aside and let them through. The resting chamber aboard the Vorthian vessel was dark and warm. The air inside was heavy and slightly sweet, carrying a scent that Thessalonaryu had once described as the smell of deep time. The walls were smooth and dark, and the chamber was enormous, large enough to hold Kale Vorithshan even in his full size, though the old dragon was much diminished now. He lay along the far wall, his body curled slightly inward, his great scales dull where they had once been brilliant. Council delegates from dozens of species watched through live feeds from the station. Nobody spoke in those rooms. People sat very still. Calvin Dury walked into the chamber without being announced. He had his toolkit with him still. He had forgotten to leave it behind, and no one had thought to ask him to. His boots made soft sounds on the floor. He crossed the chamber slowly, looking at Kale Vorithshan the whole time, and there was something in his expression that was not awe exactly, but something close to it. Something older than awe. Something like the quiet feeling of seeing someone you have not seen in a long time. Kale Vorithshan opened one eye. It was enormous, golden and deep, with a vertical pupil that contracted slightly as it found Calvin in the dim light. For a moment nothing happened. The old dragon simply looked at him. Then, very slowly, something changed in that eye. The exhaustion was still there, but something else came into it too. Something that, if you watched carefully, looked almost like relief. Calvin walked all the way up to the dragon's jaw. He placed his hand flat against the scales there, scales that were warm and rough under his palm, and he leaned forward slightly and spoke a word. Just one word. Quietly. In a language that no translation device on the live feed could process. It was not a known language. It was not any language in any database the Council had ever compiled. It was a Vorthian true name, spoken exactly as it had been given. Kale Vorithshan exhaled. It was a long and very slow breath, and the warmth of it moved Calvin's hair. The old dragon closed his eye again and was still. In the viewing rooms across the station, people who had been watching the feed were quiet for a long time. Then Calvin turned around and faced Thessalonaryu and Solvarith and the small group of people who had come in with them. He looked slightly embarrassed, the way someone looks when they have done something personal in front of a larger audience than they expected. Solvarith asked him, carefully, if he would be willing to explain. Calvin thought about it for a moment and then said yes. 9 years ago, Calvin had been doing his late-night maintenance rounds in the lower maintenance corridors of the station. It was around 2 in the morning, quiet, empty, the kind of hour when the station felt almost peaceful. He had turned a corner in Corridor 7 Delta and found something in the space between 2 large utility housings. Something very big. Something that was clearly in pain. He had not known what it was at first. It was dark in that section, and the creature was partially folded in on itself. Calvin had crouched down and shone his work light at it and seen scales and a wing and an eye looking back at him. He had not screamed. He said he was not sure why. except that the eye looking at him did not seem dangerous. It seemed hurt and tired and very alone. Kael Vorithshan had been traveling in a small and disguised form, a fraction of his true size, something the very old Vorthian were apparently capable of. His dimensional anchor, the internal mechanism that allowed him to hold that smaller form, had failed. He was stranded, too weak to shift back fully without rest, and his body had taken a wound from a hard landing in the corridor. Calvin had gotten water from the maintenance supply room. He had used a sealant compound from his kit on the wound, a general-purpose compound that turned out, by luck or coincidence, to be chemically compatible with Vorthian biology. He had pulled an old thermal blanket from the emergency locker 2 doors down and draped it over as much of the creature as it would cover. And then, because it was late and the dragon did not seem inclined to leave, and neither did Calvin, he had stayed. He stayed for 3 nights. He brought food each night, his own meals, mostly, which he shared without making a fuss about it. He sat in the corridor and talked. He talked about Ohio and about his ex-wife and about a dog he used to have. He played music from his phone, old country songs that echoed strangely in the corridor. And eventually, slowly, the old dragon began to talk back. Kael Vorithshan had been traveling alone for decades by then. He had grown tired in the way that very old things sometimes grow tired, not of life exactly, but of the weight of it, of carrying 40,000 years of memory without anyone to share even a small part of it with. He had not planned to say much. But Calvin had not asked him to be anything in particular. He had not been impressed or reverent or frightened. He had just been present, calm and ordinary and kind. On the 3rd night, the old dragon had told Calvin his name. He said later that it surprised even himself. But it had felt right, in the way that things sometimes do when you stop thinking about whether they are appropriate and just let them be true. Calvin had listened carefully and remembered the name, because Calvin was the kind of person who listened carefully to things people told him. He had not understood the full significance of it at the time. He had assumed the old creature had family and friends who already knew it. He had not told anyone because it had not seemed like his story to tell. The chamber was very quiet when Calvin finished speaking. Thessanaryu was looking at the floor. Solvareth stood with his hands folded, saying nothing. Somewhere in a viewing room across the station, the Zathri delegate Provsol was watching the feed. No one reported what expression he wore. Calvin looked around at all of them and asked if he had done something wrong. Thessanaryu looked up. He said, slowly and clearly, that Calvin had done the only right thing that had happened in this entire situation, and that Kael Vorithshan had always had extraordinarily good judgment. Kael Vorithshan passed away 3 hours and 40 minutes after Calvin's visit. Thessanaryu was with him at the end, along with 2 other Vorthian who had traveled a long distance when they heard the news. It was quiet. There was no drama in it. The old dragon simply breathed slower and slower, and then stopped. Thessanaryu sat with him for a long time afterward. Nobody hurried him. Across the station, the Galactic Council held a brief and formal moment of silence in the main chamber. Solvareth spoke a few words about Kael Vorithshan, his age, his history, the civilizations he had witnessed, the sons he had outlived. It was a short speech, and Solvareth did not try to make it more than it was. Some things were simply too large for speeches. The news spread quickly through the galaxy. Most species responded with some degree of solemnity. The Vorthian, scattered and few as they were, received the news in their own ways and in their own traditions. And then attention turned back to Calvin Dury. Vorthian tradition on this point was very clear. The person who held a true name was not simply a keeper of a secret. They were a keeper of memory. In Vorthian culture, the memory keeper was considered one of the most significant roles a person could hold. More significant, in many cases, than a title or a position of power. A memory keeper carried the identity of the departed forward into the living world. Without a memory keeper, a being's existence eventually dissolved from the record of things. The Vorthian community, what remained of it, formally petitioned the Galactic Council. They requested that Calvin Dury be recognized as Kael Vorithshan's memory keeper. They offered him a Vorthian ceremonial name. They offered him a seat at their annual rites, which were conducted every 50 years and attended by the remaining Vorthian and any guests they chose to invite. They offered him a small carved stone that the Vorthian gave to memory keepers, which was considered one of the most meaningful objects in their culture. Calvin received all of this information sitting in the station's small break room, drinking a cup of very bad coffee. Thessalonaryu delivered it personally, sitting across from him at the break room table and reading from a formal document that he had clearly prepared with great care. Calvin listened to all of it. He sat quietly for a while after Thessalonaryu finished. Then he said he was honored, and that he would accept. He asked if he could keep his job. Thessalonaryu had not expected that question. He said that of course Calvin could keep his job. Calvin said good, because he liked his job and was not sure what else he would do with himself. The carved stone was presented the following week in a small ceremony that Calvin asked to keep private. He put the stone in his locker afterward, next to a photo of his dog and an extra pair of work gloves. The Galactic Council, for its part, quietly amended its formal search protocols. A full review of the investigation process was ordered, and the revised protocol that came out of that review included a specific provision that all individuals working in support and maintenance roles aboard any council facility must be included in any council-wide search for persons of significance. The amendment passed without opposition, which was unusual for a council that disagreed on most things. Prof. Sol, the Zathri delegate who had made the remarks about human cultural depth, did not publicly retract his words. But he also did not repeat them. He went about his business quietly for the next several months and avoided the topic when it came up in conversation, which it did, fairly often. Thessalonaryu stayed on the station for the better part of a year. He and Calvin fell into a quiet routine. Most evenings, if Calvin's shift ended at a reasonable hour and Thessalonaryu was not needed elsewhere, they would meet in the break room or in one of the station's small observation corridors and talk. Thessalonaryu would ask Calvin what he remembered of those 3 nights in the corridor, and Calvin would tell him, carefully, in order, going back to details he had not mentioned before when he remembered them. Thessalonaryu listened and recorded everything on a small device he carried. It was slow work. 40,000 years of memory does not organize itself quickly, and most of what Kale Vorithshan had told Calvin were fragments, stories, observations, moments from across the long stretch of his life. Some of them were small and simple. Some of them were enormous. Calvin told them all without trying to make them into something more than what they were, and Thessalonaryu said more than once that this was probably the right way to do it. A Vorthian oral historian named Viesta eventually joined them, and the 3 of them spent several months working through the material together, building something that had not existed before, a complete account of Kale Vorithshan's life, assembled from what he had chosen to share during 3 nights in a maintenance corridor with a janitor from Ohio. It was recorded on a tablet. Battered, slightly cracked on one corner, the kind of tablet you could buy cheaply at any station supply shop. Calvin carried it in his work bag along with his scanner and his spare filter packs. The Galactic History Archives eventually asked for a copy. They received it, treated it with the kind of care they reserved for primary documents, and filed it under the name Kale Vorithshan had used to introduce himself to Calvin in that corridor, a name that was not his true name, but a traveling name, informal and warm, the kind you give someone when you simply want them to know what to call you. Late at night, when the station was quiet and his shift was done, Calvin would sometimes walk the lower maintenance corridors. His footsteps were familiar in those hallways. He knew which floor panels creaked and which ventilation units hummed too loud and which corners caught the light in a particular way. He would pause sometimes in Corridor 7 Delta, in the space between the 2 large utility housings. He would stand there for a moment, not doing anything in particular. Just standing. Then he would pick up his mop, or his toolkit, or whatever he was carrying that night, and he would walk on. The galaxy had been walked through by a legend for years. It had just never thought to look near the floor.